April 15, 1952. More than 200 people filed into St. Thomas Protestant Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue for the funeral of Florence Adele Vanderbilt Twombly. She had been 98 years old, the wealthiest woman most of those mourners had ever met, and the last surviving grandchild of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man whose railroads had once moved more freight than any private enterprise in American history. Outside, the street didn't know her anymore. Fifth Avenue in 1952 was a corridor of glass, steel, and luxury retail. Where Florence's father had built his triple palace, 3 connected brownstone townhouses in Italian Renaissance style, there were commercial office buildings. Where her brother, Cornelius II, had kept a 137-room mansion stretching the full block between 57th and 58th Streets, there was a Bergdorf Goodman department store. Where her sister-in-law Alva had staged the most famous ball of the Gilded Age, a 39-story office building held a Zara on its ground floor. The mansions were gone. The family's physical claim on the city that had made them famous had been erased, mostly in a single decade 2.5 generations ago. Florence had moved in 1926, not because she was driven out, but because she chose a better location further up the avenue. She'd had a new 70-room mansion built at 1 East 71st Street, designed by Warren and Wetmore. She lived there for the next 26 years. Her will, probated on April 19th, left the 71st Street house to her daughter Ruth. Her Newport estate, Vinland, a 50-room Romanesque revival mansion in red sandstone at Ochre Point, went to her daughter Florence Burden. She left $320,000 in specific charitable gifts, $125,000 to St. Thomas Church, $50,000 each to the 3 Arts Club and the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, $25,000 to Memorial Hospital in Morristown, New Jersey, and smaller amounts to Episcopal churches in Madison and Newport. The broader Vanderbilt fortune was gone by this point, truly and generationally gone. But Florence Twombly's personal fortune was intact. She died spending money with precision. That is the first thing you need to know about this story. The second is everything that led up to it. December 8, 1885, Manhattan. William Henry Vanderbilt was 64 years old and in a business meeting with Robert Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, when a stroke took him. He died that afternoon at his Fifth Avenue home. The estate he left behind was valued at approximately $200 million. Harper's Weekly attempted to put that number into human scale. Vanderbilt's fortune, the magazine wrote, exceeded the total value of all assessed property in Nebraska, Colorado, Nevada, and Oregon combined. Another estimate calculated that he had been earning roughly $19.73 per minute at his peak. He had inherited approximately $95 million from his own father, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had died in 1877, and nearly doubled it in under 9 years through railroad management so efficient that contemporaries struggled to comprehend it. A 1920 New York Times article noted that some estimates of the estate ran as high as $300 million, though the exact value never became public. The figure $200 million is the one most sources converged on, and even at the conservative end, it made William Henry the single wealthiest private individual in American history at the moment of his death. He left 9 children. 1 had died in infancy. Of the 8 who survived him, 4 were sons and 4 were daughters. The sons, primarily Cornelius II and William K., received the bulk in roughly equal shares. The daughters received the city houses in which they lived and secondary distributions from the estate. Charitable bequests were substantial. $200,000 to Vanderbilt University, $100,000 each to St. Luke's Hospital, the New York YMCA, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. $50,000 to the American Museum of Natural History. This wasn't stinginess toward the daughters. Their inheritances still made them among the wealthiest women in America. But the structure of the will contained the seed of everything that followed. 8 children dividing a fortune it had taken 2 generations to build. Each of those 8 would have children. Each of those would have children. The arithmetic was already in motion. The daughters were distinct people. This matters because the temptation in telling the Vanderbilt story is to treat them as a monolithic class of heiresses rather than individuals with different personalities, different ambitions, and different fates. Margaret Louisa Vanderbilt Shepherd was born July 23, 1845, the eldest. She married Elliot Fitch Shepherd, a prominent New York lawyer, banker, and newspaper publisher, and occupied one wing of the triple palace that her father had built at 640 to 642 Fifth Avenue, a complex of 3 connected townhouses that together formed the anchor of what would become known as Vanderbilt Row. Margaret was the most private of the 4. One contemporary account noted that she had utterly escaped publicity, although she inherited like her sisters. She directed her energy toward philanthropy, the YMCA, whose hotel she helped fund, the YWCA. Her summers went to Bar Harbor, Maine, where the Shepherds rented up to 3 large cottages simultaneously for family and retinue. At the time of her death in March 1924, she was actively constructing a 600-acre estate in Westchester County. That estate eventually became Sleepy Hollow Country Club. She was 79. The first of the 4 to go, and the quietest exit any of them made, Emily Thorne Vanderbilt Sloane White was born in 1852. She occupied the other half of the Triple Palace. Tiny, energetic, and authoritarian, a red-headed woman who ran her Massachusetts summer estate like a well-administered hotel. That estate, Elm Court in Lenox and Stockbridge, was 92 rooms designed by Peabody and Stearns, begun in 1888, with what admirers described as the finest gardens in New England. Emily became the Queen of Lenox society, a title nobody disputed because nobody wanted to. A schedule was posted in the hallway each morning. Guests signed up for activities or Emily signed them up herself. Meals were served at specific hours. When Emily finished a course, she signaled the plates cleared, regardless of whether anyone else was done. She didn't apologize for this. Her first husband, furniture magnate William Douglas Sloane, died in 1915. At 68, she married for a second time, Henry White, 70, former U.S. ambassador to France and one of the American signatories of the Treaty of Versailles. He died at Elm Court in 1927 after an unsuccessful surgery. Emily continued, undeterred. She died in July 1946 at 94, having outlived 2 husbands, both world wars, and most of the world she had grown up in. Eliza Osgood Vanderbilt Webb, known universally as Lila, was the youngest daughter, born September 20th, 1860. She was the informal one, more interested in agriculture than architecture, more at home on a golf course than at a ball. Hard of hearing for much of her life, she married Dr. William Seward Webb, who had abandoned medicine for railroad investment, and together they built Shelburne Farms in Shelburne, Vermont, on the shore of Lake Champlain south of Burlington. 3,800 acres of farm, field, and forest, with landscape designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and buildings by New York architect Robert Henderson Robertson. The estate was conceived as a model agricultural enterprise, not purely a pleasure property. Dr. Webb wrote to President William Howard Taft, inviting him to come to Shelburne Farms for tea. Today, it's a National Historic Landmark and still makes its own farmhouse cheddar. Lila died in July 1936. And then there was Florence. Florence Adele Vanderbilt Twombly was born January 8, 1854, married Hamilton McCown Twombly in 1877, and proceeded to live for another 75 years after that. Wikipedia describes her as one of the most formidable grandes dames in New York history, known for rigidly maintaining high standards of living, style, and etiquette. A 1946 Collier's profile translated that description into specifics: 15 automobiles, a chef earning $25,000 a year, a butler assisted by 4 footmen, a 70-room Manhattan mansion, and more than 100 servants at her New Jersey country estate. She hated the press. She expected dinner guests to leave when she was ready for them to leave. When the butler played Brahms' Lullaby on the estate's 8,000 pipe organ, dinner was over. First-time visitors who hadn't arranged for their coachman to return at the right moment were left standing at the front door. Florence wasn't a warm woman. She was a precise one. Between roughly 51st and 59th Streets, Fifth Avenue in the 1880s and 1890s was physically dominated by the Vanderbilt family. 8 mansions lined this stretch, not uniformly planned, but accumulated over years as the family purchased adjacent plots and built on them, until the cluster earned a name: Vanderbilt Row. Some city residents, with less admiration, called it Vanderbilt Alley. The anchor was William Henry's Triple Palace at 640 to 642 Fifth, 3 connected townhouses where he lived with his wife and where his married daughters Margaret and Emily kept their families. Henry Clay Frick, riding past the construction in the early 1880s, reportedly told his companion Andrew Mellon, "That is all I shall ever want." He later moved into 645th himself. Up the block at 665th stood William K. Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau, 60 rooms of French Renaissance Indiana limestone, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the house Alva Vanderbilt had used to force Mrs. Astor's hand and admit the family to the social register. Spanning 57th to 58th Streets was the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, 137 rooms, reportedly the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. And tucked between, at 680 and 684 Fifth, were the 2 sister houses given as wedding gifts: Eliza Webb's at 680 and Florence Twombly's at 684, both designed by John B. Snook in a mixture of Flemish stepped roofs, French Renaissance turrets, and Queen Anne chimneys. One historical account describes them charitably as architectural mishmashes. They weren't the grandest buildings on the block, but they were part of the claim this family had laid to the most visible street in America. In January 1892, Florence and Eliza hosted joint leap year dinner parties at their adjoining houses, with a dance in Eliza's reception room afterward. About 100 invitations went out. This wasn't a special occasion. This was a Tuesday. The city townhouses were social infrastructure. The estates were statements, physical declarations that the Vanderbilt name had weight beyond Manhattan real estate values and social seasons. Florence's Florum was completed in 1897 in Madison, New Jersey, 25 miles from Manhattan. Stanford White of McKim, Mead & White designed the mansion, inspired by the south front of Hampton Court Palace, as built by Christopher Wren in 1689. The name combined the owners' first names, Florence and Hamilton, into a single word. The result was 110 rooms on 800 acres. The entrance hall ran 150 feet, lined with marble and 12 busts of Roman Caesars. The drawing room held 10 tapestries originally presented by Louis XIII of France to Cardinal Barberini of Rome in 1630. There was an 8,000 pipe organ. The staircases and multiple fireplaces were marble. Every bedroom had an ensuite bathroom and a dressing room. The carriage house, built of Belfast brick at a cost of $85,000, originally sheltered 30 horses. As the automobile age settled in, it was converted into a motor stable. By the 1940s, it held 15 cars in total, including 6 maroon Rolls-Royces, each bearing the Twombly coat of arms on the side doors. The coachmen and footmen were liveried in matching maroon. Florence employed a full-time staff of 126 at Florham, including 30 dedicated gardeners. The working farm on the estate ran 400 head of Guernsey dairy cattle, 10 greenhouses, a Hackney stud farm, and an orangery producing citrus fruits, figs, nectarines, and grapes for the dining room table. Social arbiter Frank Crowninshield, a frequent Florham guest, described the experience to a New Yorker interviewer before his death in 1947. You go to the Twomblys in Madison on a Sunday. 11 acres of rolling lawn, 25 kinds of evergreens. It may be wrong to keep 4 men to mow the grass, but it does seem a pity that all that has to disappear. It has to do with taste and elegance. And if you don't have those things in the world, the results might be quite serious. Lila's Shelburne Farms was built with a different intention. Purpose, rather than spectacle. Olmsted's original landscape plan covered 3,800 acres. Robertson's Tudor Revival and Queen Anne buildings are still standing on the National Historic Landmark property. The farm now operates as a nonprofit education center for sustainability and still produces its own farmhouse cheddar. Emily's Elm Court in the Berkshires had 92 rooms, with lawns that hosted the Lenox Horse Show. Emily was the first major Gilded Age cottager in the Berkshires. An argument can be made she enticed the others to the region. The estate still operates today as an event venue. Margaret's Westchester estate, 600 acres designed by McKim, Mead & White, she never finished. It became Sleepy Hollow Country Club. Architectural historian John Foreman called it probably the best McKim, Mead & White house extant in Westchester County. Every one of these estates was built to last. Every one of them outlasted the fortune that funded it. Newport, Rhode Island was where the Gilded Age performed itself every summer for approximately 8 weeks between June and September. The ritual was explicit and precise. Afternoon carriage drives along Bellevue Avenue, calling card exchanges, invitation negotiations for dinners that could determine a family's social standing for the following year. Ward McAllister, the premier social arbiter of the late 19th century, had codified the rules. Mrs. Astor's 400, the number her ballroom could hold, defined who counted. The Vanderbilt family's admission to this world had been secured primarily by Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William K. Vanderbilt, whose 1883 ball at the Petit Chateau forced Mrs. Astor to formally call on her. That confrontation belonged to a different branch. By the time the 4 daughters of William Henry were managing their own households, the battle was finished. They had inherited the social position already won. Florence presided over Newport from Vinland, the 50-room Romanesque revival mansion in red sandstone on Ochre Point that the Twomblys had purchased in 1896 and substantially enlarged between 1907 and 1910, with Ogden Codman redesigning the interiors. She was, by multiple accounts, among the last women in Newport who maintained the full etiquette of the Gilded Age social season without irony or nostalgia. She wasn't preserving it. She was living it. Margaret summered in Bar Harbor. Lila retreated to Shelburne Farms, which was more working farm than resort. Emily centered herself in the Berkshires, where nobody called her the Queen of Lenox to her face, but everyone called her that everywhere else. The Newport social world began its slow dissolution after the First World War, as income taxes cut into the fortunes that had sustained the ritual, and American culture lost patience with the elaborate performance of inherited status. By the 1940s, the season was a shadow of what it had been. In 1948, the Breakers, the Cornelius Vanderbilt II Newport cottage, was opened to the public as a museum by the Preservation Society of Newport County. Florence was alive for that. She was 94. The demolition of the family's New York legacy happened in stages, but the decisive blow came in 1926. That year, multiple Vanderbilt properties changed hands simultaneously. The Petit Chateau at 660 Fifth was sold to a developer and demolished. 666 Fifth Avenue, a commercial office building, replaced it. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 57th Street, the largest private residence in Manhattan's history, was sold to the Braested Realty Corporation and knocked down. Bergdorf Goodman opened on the site in 1928. Emily sold her half of the Triple Palace for $3.5 million, sealing the fate of the building she had shared with Margaret for decades. It came down in stages, the last sections falling in 1949. Florence, at 72, watched this from her new 70-room house at 71st Street. She had commissioned it. She wasn't displaced. She upgraded. Her original townhouse at 684 Fifth had been sold to John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1925, and its subsequent demolition for a skyscraper was an economic calculation, not a humiliation. Eliza's family had been even earlier in their exit. They sold 685th to Rockefeller in 1913, 13 years before the major demolition wave, when it became clear that maintaining a residential property on that rapidly commercializing block made no financial sense. The Webbs moved to Shelburne Farms permanently. Both 680 and 684 Fifth were eventually replaced by a single commercial skyscraper, whose anchor retail tenant, as of recent decades, has been the Gap. What replaced Vanderbilt Row were commercial buildings, office towers, and luxury retailers. One structure from the family's Fifth Avenue holdings survived: 647 Fifth Avenue, one of a pair of George Vanderbilt mansions built in 1905 and known as the Marble Twins. The New York Times architecture critic Christopher Gray covered its 1995 restoration as a Versace store, calling it the last surviving Vanderbilt-built mansion south of Central Park. It currently houses the Versace boutique. That is the physical legacy of the most powerful family in American history on the street that once bore their name. One building, housing European luxury goods, recognizable only to people who already know what they're looking for. The standard explanation for the Vanderbilt family's financial decline is that they spent too much. That's true, but incomplete. The structural problem ran deeper and was built into the inheritance from the moment William Henry's will was read. Start with the division. 8 surviving children, the bulk to 2 sons. The daughters and younger sons received houses and secondary distributions. Each of those children had children. Each of those grandchildren had children. By 1973, when 120 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion, not one was a millionaire. The fortune that Harper's Weekly had compared to the combined assessed property of 4 states had passed through 3 generations and was gone. The Commodore had concentrated wealth ferociously. William Henry had distributed it, more fairly, more humanely, but far more widely. Nobody replaced the concentrated engine of new capital generation after William Henry died. The 16th Amendment arrived in 1913, establishing a federal income tax, initially 7% on incomes above $500,000, but escalating rapidly through the war years and never returning to anything near the original rates. For a family accustomed to keeping essentially all of its railroad dividends, this was an entirely new cost of existence. The Revenue Act of 1916 added a federal estate tax, designed explicitly, as one legal analysis from the period put it, as a backstop to the income tax, taxing the income of the wealthy at death. By 1920, New York State was pressing a $500,000 estate tax claim on a single Vanderbilt gift transfer. The machinery was fully operational. Meanwhile, the railroad income stream that had funded everything was in structural decline. Automobiles had been cutting into freight since the 1920s. Airlines were beginning to erode passenger traffic. The rail monopolies of the Gilded Age were being regulated, competed with, and eroded. What had been the source of an almost inconceivable private fortune was becoming a contested, shrinking industry. Most of the heirs produced no new income to compensate. Hamilton Twombly was the exception. His investments substantially grew Florence's share, leaving her in 1910 considerably richer than most of her siblings. His financial discipline was real and couldn't be replicated. Arthur T. Vanderbilt II, a family descendant who wrote the definitive account of the fortune's collapse, put it plainly. The family produced no businessmen who could fill the shoes of the Commodore. The machine had two great operators, the Commodore who built it, William Henry who doubled it, and then it stopped being operated and started being consumed. Modern financial press uses the Vanderbilt family as the canonical example of a three-generation fortune dissolution. The math confirms the canon. Florence Twombly at 90 was still rotating between three properties and paying a chef $25,000 a year. Florence at 95 still received guests at Florham and Vinland. Florence at 98 still had standards that most Americans of 1952 couldn't have imagined. She had outlived everything except her own discipline. Her life had contained genuine tragedy. Her daughter Alice, 16 years old and on the eve of her society debut, died of pneumonia at Florham on New Year's Day, 1896. Her son Hamilton Jr., 18 years old and bound for Harvard, drowned in Squam Lake in New Hampshire in July 1906 while working as a camp counselor at a Groton School students' camp. Seized by cramps, watched by several bystanders, gone before anyone reached him. His father never recovered from it. Hamilton McCown Twombly Sr. died in January 1910, his obituary attributing the death partly to a broken heart over his son's loss. Florence was 56 when her husband died. She lived 42 more years. The two daughters who survived, Florence Burden and Ruth Twombly, each managed their own lives alongside their mothers. Ruth became a philanthropist, a tennis player, and the founder of the Opportunity Shop, a charity thrift store in Manhattan. She never married. She and Florence shared Florham carefully, scheduling their different social circles on alternate weekends, each retreating to her own corner of a house with 110 rooms when the other was entertaining. There was enough space. Florence's personality as a hostess was famous and somewhat alarming. The 8,000 pipe organ in the entrance hall announced the end of evening gatherings by playing Brahms' Lullaby. When the butler played, dinner was over. Guests who hadn't arranged for their coachman to return at the right time found themselves standing at the door. Crown and Shield's New Yorker observation from the same period. Take away all of Mrs. Twombly's possessions, and you make an awful mistake. It has to do with taste and elegance, and if you don't have those things in the world, the results might be quite serious. Florence was born in 1854, when the Commodore was still assembling his railroad empire. She saw the Civil War end from childhood. She watched the Gilded Age built, peaked, and dismantled. She was alive for the income tax, the estate tax, Prohibition, the Depression, 2 world wars, the atomic bomb, and the beginning of the Korean War. She watched her family's mansions demolished and replaced by department stores. She watched her nephew's Newport cottage turned into a museum. She watched the fortune her grandfather had accumulated evaporate until 120 of his descendants could meet at a university bearing his name, and not one of them could call themselves a millionaire. She kept the Rolls-Royces in maroon. She kept the chef at $25,000. She kept the 4 footmen. She moved between 3 estates and refused to speak to journalists and played Brahms when the evening was done. Here is where the title of this video owes an honest accounting. The Vanderbilt sisters didn't die in poverty. Florence Twombly died in a 70-room Manhattan mansion with a Newport estate and $320,000 in charitable legacies still to dispense. Emily died at 94 at Elm Court. Lila died at Shelburne Farms on her own land. Margaret died building a new estate. None of these women ended their lives in financial distress. The ruin was something else entirely. The fortune their father assembled in 1885, the greatest private fortune in American history at that moment, was gone within 3 generations. The physical empire on Fifth Avenue was demolished while the sisters were alive to witness it. The social world they had been born into had been museumified and open to tourists for an admission fee, while Florence was still ordering maroon Rolls-Royces. The railroad income that had funded everything was gone. The tax structure that arrived after 1913 guaranteed that no similar accumulation could happen again in the same form. What the sisters lost wasn't their money. They lost their world's significance. They went from being at the center of American power, the women the entire country envied, whose parties set the social calendar, whose addresses defined where civilization happened, to being relics. Wealthy relics, comfortable relics, but relics nonetheless. Florence Twombly, at 98, was a woman performing a civilization that had already closed. The maroon Rolls-Royces in the Florham stable, the chef who earned more than most Americans made in a decade, the butler and the 4 footmen, the Brahms lullaby at the end of dinner. These weren't symbols of power anymore. They were the habits of a woman who had learned a certain way to live and refused to unlearn it, even as the world those habits were meant to impress had moved entirely on. The tragedy of the Vanderbilt sisters isn't financial ruin. It's the tragedy of outliving your own context, of watching the architecture of your world demolished while you were still inside it. Literally, in the case of Vanderbilt Row, and figuratively in every other sense. Of being the last person alive who remembered what it felt like to be at the absolute center of American life, when being a Vanderbilt meant unimaginable power rather than a historical curiosity. Florham is now Fairleigh Dickinson University's Madison campus. Students attend classes in rooms where Florence once held court. The stable where 6 maroon Rolls-Royces waited with Twombly coats of arms on their doors is an academic building. The 8,000 pipe organ is silent. The 400-head Guernsey dairy herd is gone. Vinland is Macaulay Hall at Salve Regina University in Newport. Florence Burden donated it in 1955. Shelburne Farms is a National Historic Landmark that still makes cheese from a herd of brown Swiss cows. Elm Court is an event venue in the Berkshires. Sleepy Hollow Country Club stands on the acreage Margaret Shepherd never finished. The Vanderbilt family had built more of the physical American landscape than any other private family in the country's history. Grand Central Terminal, the Biltmore, the Breakers, Marble House, and Vanderbilt Row, 8 mansions on Fifth Avenue that had made one family's dominance visible in stone and limestone for 3 decades. Nearly all of it's either gone or open to the public. Margaret died in 1924, Lila in 1936, Emily in 1946. Florence held on for 6 more years, the lone survivor of a civilization that had already closed around her. Florence Adele Vanderbilt Twombly died on April 11, 1952, and her funeral drew 200 people to a church on the avenue that had once been her family's street. She was the last child of William Henry Vanderbilt, the last grandchild of the Commodore, the last person alive who had been inside the rooms when they were still alive with Gilded Age purpose, when a Vanderbilt address on Fifth Avenue meant something that no amount of money alone could buy today. When she was gone, there was no one left who had been there at the beginning. That is what total ruin looks like when it comes slowly, politely, and dressed in maroon. Subscribe for more stories like this.